Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. Today we're looking at the third Mad Max movie, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. Now this movie has the fanbase split whether or not this was a nosedive for the franchise or the peak of it. That's what we're going to examine here. Is this movie a noteworthy entry to the franchise that is just overhated, or is the hatred deserved? If the hatred is deserved, then what is the reason for the hatred? Now, before we get started, make sure to follow the blog, MetrObeliskradio.blogspot.com, where you can stay up to date on all MetrObelisk Radio uploads, no matter if they're exclusive to YouTube, BitChute, LBRY, wherever you're currently watching this on. So with that out of the way, let's get right into Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. Now, as always, we're going to start off with the creative team, and we're going to start with the directors. Yes, the directors. And this movie was directed by George Miller. His other directing credits include the segment Nightmare at 20,000 Feet for the Twilight Zone movie that was released in the mid-'80s. The segment obviously being a remake of the classic episode of the television series starring William Shatner, Lorenzo's Oil, The Witches of Eastwick, Babe, Pig in the City, Happy Feet, and Happy Feet 2. And the second director on this movie was George Ogilvy. I'm sorry if I butchered that fucking name, but I'm not Australian, so I can get away with it. Now, he co-directed this movie with Miller, and his directing credits include movies such as Shortchanged, The Place at the Coast, and The Crossing. The Crossing being an early Russell Crowe movie. Basically, if you're outside of Australia like myself, you've probably never seen or ever heard of these movies. And yes, the co-directing on this movie was intended by George Miller because of their work on the miniseries Bodyline. Now let's go ahead and jump ahead to the writers, and we'll start with the man himself, George Miller. His writing credits include all of the Mad Max movies and all other movies I've listed under his directing credits, with the exception of the Twilight Zone movie. He also wrote a TV miniseries called Bodyline, which he and George Ogilvy worked on, and he also wrote the first Babe movie. And then let's jump to Terry Hayes. He actually returned for Beyond Thunderdome. He was one of the co-writers for this movie. His other writing credits include the theatrical cut of Payback with Mel Gibson, Vertical Limit with Chris O'Donnell, and From Hell with Johnny Depp. Now let's jump into the character analysis portion of our retrospectives, and we got to start with the man himself, Mel Gibson as Max. In this movie, he starts out as the man with no name character, where he strolls into town, tries to solve the problem. Then he gets banished into the wasteland, and then from there just rejects everything thrown his way, goes back to Bartertown, and then the movie ends. Next, we have Tina Turner as Auntie Entity. Now, she is the primary quote-unquote villain in this movie. Now, the problem with that is that there wasn't a lot shown of her in the movie. She hires Max to do a job, he doesn't complete it, so as his punishment, he gets banished. Online, everyone is claiming that she was a tyrant, but there's nothing in the movie to really suggest that. This is going to tie back into Max's character. The problem with Max in this movie is he doesn't have a good villain. He doesn't have Toe Cutter that's hunting him down because Max killed one of his own people, or a Humongous who wants to come into town and take the oil and basically take no prisoners while he's at it. There's no real motive for Auntie to be the villain. In fact, she's the one that really gets screwed in the movie. Master Blaster is taking control away from her, so she hires Max to kill Blaster in the Thunderdome. He doesn't do it, so she has to. Then at the end, Max kidnaps the Master that's keeping Bartertown running, and then they end up blowing up most of the city because of the methane that lies beneath. So is she really a villain, or is she someone who just got screwed? Yes, she's a tyrant, but is she honestly all that bad when it comes in just the context of this movie? Now, the rest of the characters are just here to service the plot, just like in the first two movies. The funny thing is the filmmakers got Bruce Spence to come back, but he's not playing the same character that he played in The Road Warrior. It gets really weird because at one point you expect him and Max to recognize each other, but they don't. Now let's move on to our narrative analysis portion of this episode. Now, the first act of this movie is great. It starts showing Max on a vehicle that is being driven by camels. I'm assuming that the car ran out of gas in a world going through an oil shortage. He gets robbed and stumbles upon Bartertown. Now, Bartertown isn't like the small village that we see in The Road Warrior. This town not only has energy, but a functioning economy as well. How does this town get its energy? Essentially by refining pig shit down to methane. Now, the first act revolves around a power struggle between Master Blaster, who rules the underworld of Bartertown that's responsible for keeping the lights on, and Auntie, who rules the upper world. Auntie hires Max to kill Blaster in the Thunderdome because she wants Master to be left alive. It makes sense since he's the brains of the operation. And Max in return gets back his vehicle, his camels, and all of the gas that he can carry to get out of town. Now, the Thunderdome is an enclosed arena where the only rule is 2 men enter, 1 man leaves. During this sequence, Max decides not to kill Blaster, forcing Auntie to do that for him. Now, Max booms out that wasn't part of the deal. Auntie then doesn't deny the deal, but the law is break a deal, spin the wheel. Max landed on Gulag, which basically was just being exiled into the desert beyond. Now, this is where the movie just grinds to a screeching halt. This is where the tribe of the Lost Boys from Peter Pan essentially comes into play. They all think that Max is somebody named Captain Walker who's come back for them to take him to the Tomorrowland of Sydney, Australia. This is where Max is rejecting the plot and part of the tribe just leaves to find civilization. Max then has to go out and rescue them. Then we get back to Bartertown. Now, why are we going back to Bartertown for Act 3? Who knows? Is it to get Max's stuff back? Well, that really didn't happen. All that really happened here is Bartertown is getting blown up, but the damage is nothing that can't be rebuilt. Max and the tribe who left come across the pilot, and he takes them out. Max has to leave the plane in order for it to take off. The plane takes off. Auntie doesn't kill Max. Instead, she leaves him out in the desert, and the plane flies all the way to Sydney. And at the very end, they try to make this movie into another Road Warrior style ending by having the leader of the tribe reiterate the story to all of the young. But this movie had none of the setup to really effectively pull that off, in my opinion. Now let's take a look at this movie's reception. Now, this movie has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 80% based on 50 critic reviews and an audience score of 49% based on 67,997 audience reviews. Now, this movie has a Metacritic score of 71 based on 18 critic reviews and a user score of 6.2 out of 10 based on 153 ratings. And this movie sits on IMDb at 6.3 out of 10 based on 124,200 reviews. Now, this movie had an estimated budget of $10 million and it grossed $36,230,219 worldwide. Now, if we adjust the numbers for inflation from 1985 to 2020, that would be a worldwide gross of $86,803,362.15. Now, at the time of release, this movie received generally positive reviews, but critics were split on if this was the highest or lowest point of the series. The primary criticisms for this movie came down to when the lost tribe of children were introduced in the movie. But the Thunderdome concept was praised along with the fight between Max and Blaster. Most critics felt that it was one of the most creative fight scenes ever filmed for an action movie. Now, by this movie, the movie had to be more plot-driven than character-driven. The first movie was showing Max as a good cop, but slowly over the movie losing his sanity and then finally snapping when his wife and son are murdered. The second movie is to build up Max as the Road Warrior, a mythological figure who came from the desert, saved the townspeople from an evil guy, and vanished as mysteriously as he appeared. To make a long story short, Max was already an established character by this movie. I can't judge it as a character piece because it was never meant to be that. I have to judge it more on the story, and I'll end the episode off with that. The first act was great. The build-up to the Thunderdome, and even the Thunderdome scene was well worth that build-up. The problem with this movie is it never recaptured the assignment that was built in the first act. Act 2 is basically Max getting rescued by the tribe of the Lost Boys, and then having to save some of them after they willingly leave. Act 3 is Max and the tribe who left going back to Bartertown to essentially get a plane to go to Sydney, that's the Tomorrowland. For a movie that's meant to be narrative-driven, this movie has an awful messy narrative structure. Now, that doesn't mean this movie is entirely terrible. If you just watch it as a fun popcorn movie, then you'll probably like it. But this movie is a pretty big deviation from the first two, in that it's unrecognizable. It's unrecognizable as a Mad Max movie. I also feel that this movie was made the way it was to garner a more mainstream audience at the time. And we can see that with the casting of Tina Turner. Tina Turner playing the quote-unquote villain of the movie. And then we get the movie's theme song from her. That was We Don't Need Another Hero, Thunderdome. And even a second song from her for the movie that was One of the Living. I believe that this ruined the movie more by trying to make it for everyone. And as the old saying goes, if you try to please everyone, then you end up pleasing no one.